Thank you so much for joining us today, taking time out of your schedules. I know it can be a busy time if you're on the academic schedule and a busy time in general for people. We are running a webinar series for the System for Earth and Extraterrestrial Sample Registration. This is something new that we're doing this fall, and we're hoping to continue this into 2025. So thank you for joining us, and we want to hear your feedback after today's session, and we'll have ways for you to do that. My name is Natalie Rea. I'm the UX and community engagement researcher for SESAR, and I'm going to be kind of the MC for today. We're also joined by Sabyul Cho, who's SESAR's data curator, and we may have other SESAR team members joining us as well. Here's the full team. SESAR is operated as part of the AIDA2 NSF data facility. So this means it's part of a broader suite or system of data repositories, SESAR being the one that's focused on samples. Because we're tailoring this presentation today to PIs and team leaders, we're going to assume a little bit of familiarity with SESAR, but we'll have some introductory slides to kick it off here. So if you've attended one of our recent webinars, just bear with me for the first couple slides. SESAR is headed up by Project Director Kirsten Leonard at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory out of Columbia University. Our product manager is Andrea Thomer out of College of Information Sciences at University of Arizona. Sabyul Cho is on the call, data curator. Sean Cow is our system engineer, myself, and then a team of technical consultants, as well as an application developer, JD, and Sarah Robinson, our business officer. So we are all funded part-time on SESAR. In some cases, we have team members that work on the other AIDA data systems. In other cases, we work on other various projects across geoinformatics and geology primarily. And so this is who keeps the lights on. So what is SESAR? SESAR is an open repository and searchable catalog for sample metadata. This is a community platform that helps make physical samples more discoverable, accessible, and reusable, and connects samples with the knowledge ecosystem derived for them. So this is a place where you can link the data sets and publications and photos and metadata that all tie back to your samples. We offer, as part of this, a workspace for sample metadata management, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, as well as curatorial review of metadata and user support as part of the creation and minting of IGSNs, which we'll get to. We also offer a catalog for discovery and access of samples. So this is a place you can come to look for samples, other samples that are out there that other users have submitted. Our website is geosamples.org. We have over 5 million samples in the SESAR² catalog, and this encompasses a wide range of sample types. So solid rocks, of course, soils, fluids, gases, biological materials, synthetic experiments. We have a global user community of over 1,600 users, and this includes everybody under the sun. So individual researchers, museums, national labs, sample and core repositories, and other funded entities and projects. And we're a repository and a resource that's recommended by funders and publishers. We're really proud that SESAR is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. So the system started out in 2004 out of a small, an NSF small grant for exploratory research. And this was designed and its purpose was to develop the prototype for the IGSN and SESAR. And both SESAR and the IGSN have changed names over the years as their scope has expanded and as the IGSN has become increasingly adopted across disciplines. We're really proud to serve a range of users. Again, so from individual PIs to larger national collections, such as the ones that I'm showing here on the screen. And we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop to surface these collections and make them discoverable to a wider audience. And that includes showing their rich metadata that are attached to them. And so some of these collections surface basically all of their collections. Some of these entities are working day to day to bring more and more of their collections online and registered with IGSNs. So these are all available and searchable and findable to you through our catalog. Again, today we're going to focus on the metadata management side, but while I have a captive audience, I want to advertise and ask openly if you have seen our new search interface. I encourage you to check it out during the webinar today or after. This was released in this past July and resulted directly from user interviews and feedback that we've received from users over the past couple years. And so we consider this kind of an interim update. The old search interface was pretty dated and needed some work. So this is one way that we're trying to improve the system, and we have additional work scoped to make this even better. One thing that we're particularly proud of with this new interface is we've integrated MacroStrat and also are now offering extra projections for supporting people who work in the polar regions. So with that pitch kind of done, I want to move into the meat of today. We have a lot to cover, and this is an overview of what we're going to cover today. And we've saved hopefully a good amount of time for questions. I should say, if you have questions as we go, put them in the chat. I am monitoring that, and I can try to make sure we're answering some as we go, and then address the rest at the end of the presentation. PIs and team leads, I think, have unique challenges related to sample management. You know, and I am obviously preaching to the choir here for this, but you manage multiple people coming in and out. You might be managing students, you might be managing undergraduates, graduate students, people that are going to be around for differing amounts of times. The goal for today is to highlight some ways that SESAR currently has built-in support to facilitate this, and to kind of re-envision and reframe the way that maybe you've used SESAR in the past. And I'll go through all of this, you know, being transparent that we're perpetually kind of improving and iterating upon this. And so today and into the future, if you find things that you want to be able to do in the SESAR interface that you can't, we really want to hear your feedback, and we'll make sure that you have our general feedback email in the chat as well for that. So this might be the case for some people. Maybe you think of SESAR as currently the place where I go to register my samples for IGSNs. If you take one thing away from today, I hope it's that you can rethink about what SESAR is for you, and think of it instead as a sample management tool and a resource for you for managing your group samples, metadata, and linked research outputs. And I really think thinking in the long term here, you know, thinking 5, 10 plus years after a project's completion, what are the challenges you face in reconstructing metadata? What are the challenges you face in refinding all of the outputs that came from a certain sample or a certain project? These are things that SESAR is built and designed to support you in. I also want us to keep in mind a key word for today, which is flexibility. I think a lot of our users kind of get turned away or are intimidated by components of the IGSN and concepts of persistent identifiers for samples, and thinking of it as something that's really rigid. And I want to show today that there's ways to make this flexible and to iteratively incorporate it into your workflow. We're going to start with user codes. This is MySESAR, which is kind of your internal dashboard to manage samples, submit metadata for IGSNs, update metadata, etc. This is what it looks like when you log in. If you have not yet created a user account, a MySESAR account, you will find on the upper right corner of our main webpage a button for MySESAR. You will simply input your ORCID ID, and then you'll be taken to this page. When you first log in as a new user, you'll be prompted to fill in a little bit of information about your institution and yourself and your ORCID. You will also be prompted to create a user code. To talk about user codes, I want to break down a little bit the structure of the IGSN. I promise we won't go too technical, but I think this is helpful for people to know. IGSNs are simply DOIs, right? So we're used to dealing with paper DOIs when we put references in at the end of publications. IGSNs are no different. This is something new. The IGSN has not always been a DOI. This was a shift that was made back in 2021. And essentially, what has come out of this is that IGSNs are now registered through DataCite, which is a much larger international entity that mints DOIs for things like data sets, as well as now IGSNs and other research products. This comes with a lot of advantages in terms of the kind of back-end technical ways that IGSNs work. But for users, what I want to point out is that the IGSN now has a couple different components. It has this DOI prefix, which you'll see in any sort of publication DOI that is unique to the IGSN allocating agent. In this case, for us, it's SESAR. There's a number of other entities globally that mint IGSNs as well. There's a German institution, there's an Australian institution. SESAR to date is the only allocating agent that we know of that anyone from anywhere in the world can come to mint an IGSN for their samples, regardless of their country affiliation. After the DOI prefix, there's a user code, which we've been talking about, and then some additional alphanumeric suffixes. The user code pre-IGSN DOI was the component that really created that uniqueness to the persistent identifier. So we talk about wanting to have identifiers that are non-duplicated. So, you know, when we all name our sample NC01 and somebody else did the same thing 10 years ago, these are non-unique and can be difficult to disambiguate in the literature. That's one advantage of the IGSNs, is that this is this persistent, unambiguous name for the sample. Today, they still create uniqueness within SESAR. The other advantage and purpose for the user code in the past and continuing today is that this gives users flexibility in organizing their samples. As scientists, we often take care in the ways in which we name samples, and those names often have meaning. And so for a lot of our users, this user code becomes that kind of digital translation of that, and it's injecting meaning into the IGSN. That's fine, and if that's useful for you, great. But I want you to remember that the IGSN is simply a DOI. And so in the same way, if I go back a slide, in the same way that we don't typically have hangups on the alphanumeric components of a paper DOI, I would encourage you to also not have hangups on the alphanumeric components of the sample IGSN. This is a tool, a digital object identifier that we're using to better link and find samples and their outputs. That being said, if you have to choose a user code anyways, so if you want to have that contain meaning, that's great. And and we're here to support you in navigating that for your specific case. Here's some suggestions. Some people use one user code for your group at large, and so maybe this looks like your PI initials or a lab name abbreviation. Some people might want to have more granularity with those user codes. You can make as many user codes as you want in the system, and so maybe you want a dedicated user code to signify a certain grant. And so you're going to have different user codes for different grants. Or maybe you work in a field area and you have longstanding work there and you want to have a user code for that field area. That's fine too. Maybe, particularly for PhD students, maybe you want to have a single user code for a PhD student. That's fine as well. My own personal recommendation is to do option one, which is having one user code for your group at large. I think it'll make it simpler, and we have other tools that I'll highlight in a minute to support you in parsing out some of these other structures like grants, field areas, and students. So to answer the often asked question, does my choice of user code matter? No, it's up to you. And remember, IGSNs are simply DOIs. We're going to talk about parent-child IGSNs next. And again, feel free to put questions in the chat or save them for the end. SESAR gives users the ability to track detailed sample hierarchies and relationships through structured parent, child, and sibling IGSNs. So this is a site that may be familiar to a lot of you. In this case, we have boxes of rock samples with some other derivatives, right? Maybe some solo cups filled with sample powders. Maybe there's some thin section billets that we can see. There's all these derivative products that came from hand samples. And I'll say that as a metamorphic geologist, I'm going to be rock biased today, but I'm sure for those who may work on fossils or soils or water, you can translate and think of your own cases for derivative products. At SESAR, this looks like this. We have a parent hand sample, which we might mint for an IGSN, and then we have derivative products that may or may not be suitable for child IGSNs. Within SESAR, if you do choose to mint derivative products, there's a clear way to denote that. And so on the left-hand side here, I've broken up a single sample record page into these two columns to make it more readable. The left side shows kind of the top of the sample record page. This is that single sample. It's got its IGSN DOI at the top. We have some sample name information and other metadata. If we scroll down to the bottom of the page, that's what we're looking at on the right side of the screen. This sample has 3 children linked to it, and those are hyperlinked and will take me to the respective sample record landing page for these children products. In this case, they're sample powders. The advantage here is that you can, obviously track all the different kinds of derivatives that may be coming from a sample and keep things really clear and delineated and unambiguous. Sometimes we're asked, well, my parent or child sample is going to be destroyed or completely consumed during my work. Maybe I'm doing destructive analyses and I'm going to dissolve it and analyze it and be done. Should I still consider registering it for an IGSN? The answer is yes, absolutely. And to help guide you in this, ask yourself, will you publish more than one output for a sample or a set of samples? So are you going to publish a data set and maybe a paper? Are you going to have multiple papers, multiple data sets? Would you like to be able to easily export the metadata for your samples for reporting or to share with collaborators? And also, will you share your sample or samples in the future, or do you think it's likely? These are the types of things that would point you towards registering for parent and or child IGSNs. We also often get asked, does everything need a child IGSN? Absolutely not. And the catchphrase that I want to say for this and for other questions that we'll cover later is do what you can as it makes sense and as capacity allows. It's completely unrealistic to think that we're all going to be able to find the time and patience to register every single speck of dust that we generate for child IGSNs. That's not the goal here. I think keeping in mind the priorities, keeping in mind, what types of metadata and relationships you're trying to track, particularly at points where it matters in terms of collaboration and sample sharing. These are the types of things that you want to train yourself and your team members to catch and say, oh, we're about to share a sample. Let's have a conversation about strategies for IGSNs. If you're working with samples from a managed collection, so this could be a museum, this could be a core repository, please consult the repository first to determine their preferred IGSN minting policy. So we have a kind of a humorous graphic: do not pass go, do not collect your IGSNs until you've talked to a curator first. Repositories and museums are in different places, and this is evolving with respect to minting of and usage of persistent identifiers. We'll talk about legacy collections towards the end of the presentation, but if you all are dealing with legacy collections and multiple collections, you can imagine what museums and core repositories are dealing with. And so they too are figuring this out and navigating this new landscape and evolving landscape. And so they will have different desires, different policies, and they are the best to advise you on that. So we really encourage you to consult with them early and often as it relates to sharing metadata and using persistent identifiers for samples. This type of thinking, too, I want to emphasize, is important for large collaborative grants that you may be working on. Have those conversations in the field. If you're out in the fields and you're actively collecting samples that you know you're going to split, maybe talk about who is going to mint a parent IGSN so that if you all have direct cuts of the same rock, you can all have child IGSNs. That's going to be really important in tracking, particularly as this kind of propagates out with the generation of data sets at different institutions. We're going to walk through a couple existing and one new feature within MySESAR that can support you as a PI or team lead. As it relates to kind of grouping samples for different projects, as well as managing groups of people. We're going to first go back on the user codes. This is within the My Account tab of MySESAR. This is the place where you can come to create new user codes, but also importantly, to share permissions for using those user codes. So maybe you have a user code for your lab and you would like your students to be able to submit and register their samples for IGSNs, but you want them all to have your lab designated user code. You can come here and input your student's ORCID, which may also involve having a conversation about what an ORCID is and how to get one. You can input your student's ORCID and select which user code or codes they can have permission to. And then there's a variety of permission types that we offer. So they could have full permission, the ability to create, read, edit, and delete metadata, or maybe they have read-only permission, which will allow them to view samples within the account, and any iteration in between. I will say also that in every webinar we've been hosting, I want to make sure that our users know that we offer the ability to embargo sample metadata. And so if you just went out in the field and you are trying to integrate IGSNs in your workflow and you really want to get those IGSNs registered, that's fantastic. That's what we encourage you to do. Do it early while you have all the information fresh and while you're getting organized. But maybe you don't want those samples to be publicly accessible in the catalog. Maybe you're going to continue to refine and edit and add to the metadata. We support you in that. So you can register for IGSNs and embargo them for up to 2 years. Within your MySESAR account, that embargo date is editable. So if you need them to be public sooner or later, maybe you only set it as a year, but work is going slower and you want another year of having them offline, that's doable. That's completely workable within the interface. So we give you that flexibility and we support you in the need to embargo metadata. Also on this screen, you'll notice an activation date and a deactivation date. If you don't want to have to remember to go change those user permissions, and let's say you have an undergraduate, you know when they're going to graduate, you can put a deactivation date in there. You can also choose not to use these and have it indefinite, have those permissions be indefinite. Down below, you'll see kind of just a summary of all of the personnel. In this case, there's only one person, and I've covered the ORCID and the username, but you can see when that person had an active permission and what those permissions were. You can also see the user codes that you have access to. As PIs and team leads, you also deal with personnel changes on various timescales. If you have a situation in which a team member has registered samples under their own account, but maybe using your designated user code, there's a way to formally transfer ownership, or sometimes I like to get people to think of stewardship instead of ownership, but transfer that ownership of the IGSN over to you. And we'll talk about how to build this into your workflow and suggestions for doing that. But this is done through the transfer ownership tab in MySESAR and is intended to be quick and easy to use. If you need to transfer the user code itself, that's a little bit of a different conversation and one that's evolving for the SESAR team too. But essentially, we encourage you to reach out to info@geosamples.org. That's not a task that we currently support in the MySESAR interface. Currently in the MySESAR interface, we also support sample groups. This is, I think, a really underutilized feature for our users currently, and one that we as a team are working to make more efficient and easier to use and to better serve the ways in which people would want to use this feature. But you can currently come into the My Groups tab and create a group of samples. And so here, in this case, there's a group that's the UMN New Caledonia Metamorphic Rock Collection. To move some zoom controls out of the way here. There's a group description, and then we have a couple different group types that you can designate just kind of as additional metadata so you know what this is when you go to look back at it. You can set the privacy to be public or private. We don't currently surface these through the search interface, so it's not something people are going to stumble across. It's mostly internal for you to be useful to group your samples. And the advantage is here that if I click within this group that's been created, with one click, I can pull up all of the samples that constitute this collection. So this interface really is us trying to serve our individual users in particular. Museums, repositories, they often have expensive, proprietary, very complex collections management software. This is us trying to support that for some of our smaller users in particular, where they can manage different rock collections, maybe from different places or different types of physical sample collections. You'll notice too, if I go back to the prior screen, there's the ability to export this to an EarthChem library sample sheet. This gets you started on submitting data to the EarthChem repository for our users that find that repository useful as a place to deposit data. Very soon, we're going to release a new feature, which is called user groups. Currently, it would be slated to be accessible under My Accounts, but we're still working out some of the user interface components of this. My groups are designed to be broader and to better support cross-institutional collaborative needs. This would be something that you could create for say, a team that's working on a grant. You could also create it for your research lab. It's designed to be flexible, but you can create a new user group. And then within there will be a lot of different ways to query samples, contribute samples, manage team members, manage user codes attached to that. So this is coming down the pipeline. As you can see, we have it coded up in our staging interface, and we're kind of working through the bugs, breaking things, talking to people and trying to figure out and make sure that we make something that's useful, and also developing guidance for that. So we're going to be sure to advertise this when it's released and have some information about how to use this and how this kind of intersects with existing functionality for sample groups and user codes. We're really excited about this. So we're hoping it's something that's going to really add kind of value to the MySESAR interface and make this a place that you can come to and want to come to because it better serves your management needs as team leads and PIs. I wanted to touch briefly on legacy collections. I think I just have one slide. You could spend, of course, a whole presentation on legacy collections, but we often have people coming to us saying, I have so many samples that don't have IGSNs. Maybe they're mid-career, maybe they're late career. They don't really know what to do. Should I register them? Do I need to register them? How do I prioritize? We really hear you on that, and we want to support you in doing what makes sense. And so again, I say do what you can as it makes sense and as capacity allows. And some tips for this in thinking about how to prioritize. Do you have particularly unique or rare samples in your collections? So samples where the localities no longer exist, or if we're thinking about environmental samples, maybe the conditions no longer exist. Are these hard to reproduce experimental samples that have a lot of benefit and potential for reuse and application of new methods? Are they from, were the samples collected, the data collected on the samples from expensive or difficult or particularly time-consuming analytical methods where there would be a high benefit for reuse as opposed to recollection? Do you have samples that have a particularly rich history of outputs compared to others? So lots of papers or data sets to link. And also, if there's samples with strong spatial provenance versus others where maybe they were collected pre-GPS, maybe you've lost the maps. These are the things to weigh. And so I think using these as a guideline, use that to prioritize what you choose to register for IGSNs and do what you can. I think I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on how to use IGSNs, since we just talked the whole time about how to get them and how to manage people in getting them and using them and updating metadata. We get questions on where to use them. The short answer is anywhere you can. So include them in data tables, include them in data availability statements as possible, include them in text of publications as possible and if applicable, and include them in dataset and metadata if your repositories that you're submitting to support that. So in data tables, you can think of this as including a column for IGSNs. Maybe that goes alongside the sample name that you have given it. Data availability statements, we acknowledge, make sense only for shorter lists of samples. If you have a paper that's being published that used 100 or more than 100 samples, this won't be feasible. But maybe if you have a short list, include those IGSNs and data availability statements. In text, if you're going to mention a sample name, you can parenthetically kind of cite the sample. And it's important to also note that certain data repositories are currently supporting sample persistent identifiers, including IGSNs, at the metadata level. So EarthChem repository, as part of the IDA2 data facility, is unsurprisingly one of the repositories that does this. This means that when you go to submit a data set, you will be prompted with a specific dedicated field to provide IGSNs for the samples associated with the data set. This goes beyond including IGSNs in the column of a table, which is something that you also do when you submit to EarthChem. This is a way to get IGSNs embedded at the metadata level so that further linkages can ideally occur. I'm listing at the top or kind of middle of this slide here two ways to list IGSNs. And this comes directly from a data site now as the DOI minting kind of home base. There's two recommended ways to do this. There's what's called here the full display, which is an IGSN lowercase prefix with a colon and then the full URL for the DOI. There's also the short display, which I think is closer to what people are more used to seeing, which is, again, this IGSN text, a colon, and then the shortened DOI. Using that IGSN, those letters, and then a colon is really helpful because for methods that might be using machines to try to mine and find IGSNs, that IGSN is the way for people to query this, because the DOI itself, we can't tell that this is a sample DOI versus a publication DOI. So putting that IGSN, even though it looks clunky and is kind of awkward to write, that enables additional work by machines, whether that's internal with a publisher or other indexers, that allows that IGSN to be found and then linked. The other thing that I'll say is that this is evolving, as I'm sure many of you probably have encountered, maybe when publishing. Publisher guidance for how to list samples, where to list them is evolving, and different publishers are at different stages. So I know that there's a couple of Elsevier journals that actually do list out specifically for IGSNs what to do, and this is in line with what they have guidance for. They are kind of an anomaly. There's not a lot of other guidance at that specificity. And so I would say that kind of encourage you to become advocates and change agents for helping to drive the development of this infrastructure and this much needed guidance. And so that might look like asking journals where you can for clarity when sample citation guidance is unclear. It might look like checking to make sure that your IGSNs are hyperlinked and resolvable during the paper copy editing stage. So sometimes you've done your best, you've put the IGSNs in, you've followed the instructions on the last slide, you think you're going to be good. And then right when you're approving the proofs, those IGSNs aren't linked. That's not ideal. So pushing back and saying, this is supposed to be a hyperlinked DOI, just like the rest of my DOIs, that's helpful. Consider submitting to repositories that support sample persistent identifiers. And if you find repositories that don't currently support sample persistent identifiers, ask them if they have plans to support them. And finally, bring your tales of woe to us. We want to hear about the challenges that you're facing in this and where we can point you in the direction of resources or help you figure out your problem. We call these use cases. So we absolutely want to be in touch with you. Sabes has put in the chat a link to the output that we're showing on the right. This was a collaborative output that came out of a organization called Earth Science Information Partners, or ESIP. This is a 501c3 nonprofit that integrates across a lot of different earth and environmental science sectors. It's jointly supported by NASA, NOAA, and the USGS. There is a dedicated working group that works specifically on physical sample citation, metadata, credit, curation issues. And so this was a summary output that kind of outlines the process of trying to make samples more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We're getting close to the end, and then we'll have some questions. I wanted to leave some ideas for building a sample management workflow with your group. And so these are various things to consider integrating as part of you and your students or teams workflow, either post fieldwork or post experiments if you work experimentally. You could have a checklist, and this might include things like working together to define a dedicated digital place and file structure for sample metadata and data at the start of a project. Have that conversation early. Post fieldwork, a workflow could include scanning your field notebook if you work on pen and paper. It could look like photographing samples and submitting those photos alongside your submission for IGSNs in SESAR. It could look like printing IGSN QR codes, which we didn't cover in detail today, but I'm happy to answer questions on. It could look like dedicating one sample management working meeting, maybe once per year, or maybe at the beginning and the end of the summer if your group goes out and spends the summer doing a lot of different fieldwork projects. Dedicating one meeting where everybody can work on what they need to update metadata in SESAR, or maybe conduct physical sample management work down in the basement, wherever you store your collections. Make IGSN ownership transfer a part of your student or team's outboarding process or your departure or graduation process. Just build that in the same way that maybe you have students turning in theses, copies of theses, or handing over a Google folder drive or something. Make sure that IGSN ownership has been transferred and all the permissions are set up for that. And then at the outset of projects, while you're writing grants, include your intent to register samples for IGSNs in data management plans. There's been a couple different Dear Colleague letters, both out of NSF EAR and NSF OCE, as well as some funding opportunities from OCE in particular recently, related to sample management, reuse of sample collections. And so these are good things to integrate and put into your grants if you're not already. One tip is to save your SESAR batch registration files. I have one folder where I just save all of them. This can save you time if you, say, want to go add a publication DOI to a specific collection and maybe registered that collection all at once, or maybe in a couple batches. You can really easily go pull IGSNs and other metadata that you'll need to key in for that batch update. Before I hand it over for questions, I want to just highlight a couple things that are coming soon to SESAR. So I showed a little bit of the improved user group and permissions functionality that's coming down the pipeline. We're close on that. Certainly by end of 2024, I think that should be live. We have slated in 2025 some ongoing work for user interface improvements to MySESAR as a whole to kind of modernize it and make it less dated looking and make it easier to navigate around your dashboard to do the types of things that really we want to drive people to do, which is update metadata, update metadata, update metadata. Tell us when the sample is exhausted, make it easy to add that data set DOI to the 20 samples that were in that data set that was just published. Things like this should be a lot easier. And so we're working towards that. We also are on the cusp of totally overhauling the website with a new kind of backend. And as part of that, we're revising and adding a lot of improved guidance and FAQs. So we're excited about the changes on the horizon. The final thing I'll say is if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, make sure that you are. This is the best place and the place to kind of receive the earliest updates on new features and improvements, opportunities for office hours and webinars that we'll be holding in 2025. And we'll make sure that you have the link in the chat. We'll also be following up on email after the webinar today with links to a lot of the resources that we've shared. And so with that, I want to thank you again for your time. I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over